2 o'clock on the 30th of January 1649, Charles I is beheaded outside Banqueting House on Whitehall. 12 years later, Oliver Cromwell was posthumously hung and beheaded. I think it's really interesting when events that are linked somehow actually happened on the same day in history, maybe years apart. So last week we had the first representative parliament had met, and then a few hundred years, or about 400 years later I think it was, Parliament was trying Charles I. Well, we have another link. On the 30th of January we have the execution of Charles I. He had been found guilty of treason by Parliament. He didn't recognise this Parliament, but he was found guilty and he was executed on the 30th of January. 12 years later, Oliver Cromwell, Protectorate of the Commonwealth, was posthumously hung and beheaded. So let me tell you a bit more about both of those stories. Charles I was executed 30th of January 1649. You can go to his execution site, and what I find fascinating about this every time I go, because I do a tour in Whitehall, and it's just interesting to realise that people are walking through the execution site of one of our kings, probably without realising it. Here we are at Banqueting House on Whitehall, with the sun about to pop over the top there. It's here, 30th of January 1649, that Charles I was led out of a window now blocked up to be executed in front of a crowd. He was the reigning monarch, but he'd lost the English civil wars, and the parliamentarians under Oliver Cromwell had tried him for treason at the Great Hall in Westminster, just down the road from here, and had found him guilty. He was led out to a scaffolding around about the height of those first row of windows. The block on which he had to lay his neck was the small block, which meant that he, instead of other nobles who would have knelt to be executed, he had to lie down. It was another piece of humiliation on the part of the parliamentarians for Charles. It was different to how it looks now. So the gates were still in place. So actually you had almost a square packed with people who had come to watch. Why they were watching, whether they just thought this couldn't actually happen and were interested to see what was going to happen. I imagine there were people from both sides there, those wanting to see the king dead and those not. When he was executed, the sound from the crowd was like a groan. I imagine that did just happen, and shock and what happens now. He was executed at 2 p.m. and there is a clock on the top of Horse Guards Parade with the 2 blackened, and that is to signify the time at which Charles I was executed opposite, because Banqueting House and Horse Guards Parade is opposite. There's 2 stories about his shirts. He'd asked either for 2 shirts or for a thicker shirt that morning. We're 30th of January, so it's in the middle of our winter, and he did not want to appear frightened, so he didn't want to shiver, hence wanting a warmer garment to wear. Charles wasn't scared, I don't think, beyond obviously what was human and uncontrollable, but he believed he was going to a higher place. He'd always believed in his divine right to rule, as his father James I had done, and actually, well worth mentioning, he had walked through Banqueting House, and Banqueting House, if you've ever been, and if you haven't, put it on your list, has incredible painted ceiling by Rubens, and it depicts James I on there, and Charles I had those paintings commissioned, so he'd have to walk under these paintings depicting his father in heaven to go to his own death. I think probably the most upsetting part of it is to read accounts of Charles having to say goodbye to his children. I think that he from my understanding, he knew he was sort of being sacrificed, and I think he had a peace with that, because he knew it was it was greater than him, if you like. But saying goodbye to his young children really had upset him, as you would imagine. So that was 2 o'clock on the 30th of January 1649. Charles I is beheaded outside Banqueting House on Whitehall. After the execution of Charles I, Britain becomes a republic for the next 11 years, run by a man called Oliver Cromwell, a politician, a soldier, charismatic, a great leader. He was of the Puritan faith, and we saw a lot of destruction and defacing of tombs, cathedrals, anything they saw as idolatrous or for privilege. You know, they were against sort of hereditary privilege, and we see a lot of damage, including Catherine of Aragon's tomb at Peterborough Cathedral, which was destroyed, and her body luckily left alone, although they had moved the tombstone, I believe, to see if there was any jewels there with her, and there wasn't. However, when Oliver Cromwell dies, Oliver Cromwell has a grand funeral and is buried in a grand tomb in Westminster Abbey. It's another story for another day, but well worth looking into if you are interested, because he basically became another monarch. I mean, monarch means the mono part of it is one. It's one person in charge. A monarchy is one person in charge, and he certainly seemed to take on the trappings. After he dies, through a series of events, Charles II is requested to come back to Britain, and we have the restoration of the monarchy, and we have retribution. Those who signed the death warrant of his father Charles I were hunted down and executed where they could be. Any who could went into exile on the continent. But even those who'd already died in the intervening time couldn't escape. So Oliver Cromwell, along with 2 other bodies, were exhumed. They were exhumed on the 28th of January, and on the 30th of January they were pulled on a sled to Tyburn, as a live person would have been who was going to be hung there. And they were taken to Tyburn. They were hung on the gallows. Then their heads were removed and put on spikes outside Westminster, where they apparently stayed for the remainder of Charles II's reign, so about another 20 or so years. So even death didn't mean that Cromwell escaped some sort of retribution. He no longer has a tomb at Westminster Abbey. Another story that goes along with this, which is linked to the Whitehall area and which I love telling, at the top of Whitehall, on a traffic roundabout, or I call it a roundabout, traffic island, is a statue of Charles I on horseback. Now, this statue apparently was created in the reign of Charles I, and it was somehow hidden and was later erected on this spot. But this spot has another link to all the events that happened here. More of the people who signed that death warrant for Charles I were hung, drawn and quartered on that spot. So now Charles I is sat on his horse on that spot, looking down Whitehall, looking towards where he was executed.